Mookler, host of this live stream. My mind and heart have been in turmoil for a week, even more than the usual amount of turmoil with our democracy threatened by two body blows that got everybody, well, not everybody, obviously, upset. We're engaged in a battle between democracy and fascism. I think that's the best way to conceive of the whole theater of battle. But going into the debate, Joe Biden seemed clearly to be, of necessity, the champion of the survival of American democracy. His victory was essential, and I was completely reconciled to his being that champion. But then the debate happened, and people were disturbed by what they saw, and he was damaged, and people can disagree about how much he was damaged, but it raised really the question, is his being on the ballot when we absolutely have to defeat Donald Trump the best way forward? With the stakes so high as that, you don't want to do anything which is short of the one that maximizes the chance that American democracy will succeed. Every other consideration is negligible compared to that. And then the Supreme Court, which has been increasingly troubling over some years, and then with acceleration in recent months with respect to their becoming siding with the criminal against the rule of law when it came to delaying Trump's trial completely unnecessarily, and then handing down a decision which really goes far to overturn the American constitutional order in which no one is above the law. It's hard to overstate what an abomination that decision is, and these people are not stupid, and so it shows something really important about the nature of the majority that now controls the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's a huge crisis, just like the election. So what I'm going to try to do here is to share what I've come up with of what I would do if I were a Democratic leader and wanted to address both of these crises, the immediate crisis about how do the Democrats take the best possible path forward, best meaning maximizing the chance of defeating Donald Trump, and that gets the ball rolling to address what is a completely unacceptable situation in America right now, where the last word on all our conflicts is now in the hands of a Supreme Court that is not acting like a Supreme Court, but is acting like a partisan of a very ugly force. Both of those need to be addressed. I'm a marginal figure, so I can pretend that I can address them by speaking on the little platforms I have. But in addition to my being as obscure as that, I do have a leader in mind, and one who can play a constructive role, who does have the standing to address both of those crises. And so I'm actually making this video, in a sense, for an audience of one, because if I'm able to pull this off to my satisfaction, I will be sending a link of this video to this leader, who I know from experience will take seriously my suggestions and conceivably act on them. So that's an exciting place for me to be. And so let me start with the Biden crisis. What I came to as being sort of the point of entry into the problems surrounding how Democrats are relating to what is a genuine dilemma. Do you stick with Biden or do you replace him? And basically my position is, let's just keep in mind that we should do whatever maximizes the chances of victory in November. I mean, any difference between any of the possible paths forward that gets us one of the Democratic nominees, whether it's Biden or Harris or somebody else, it really doesn't matter at the level that it matters that the force of fascism not get hold of the powers of the presidency with Project 2050, I'll be a dictator from day one, that whole thing about it being laid out. I am your retribution. I mean, this is not something we want to have take over. I mean, it's beyond being a bad president. It cannot be allowed to happen. Or, since people don't always control what does happen, nothing less than our best can possibly be contemplated. So if Biden should stay in the race, the only reason should be there's no better option. The alternative is worse. And that's where I think this leader could weigh in with some kind of a declaration of, it shouldn't be difficult to set up a process which between now and the end of the Democratic National Convention does a really good job. So whether Biden should stay the course and remain our nominee, or whether he should pass the torch, we shouldn't make that decision on the basis of, oh, what a mess it's going to be. It doesn't have to be a mess, and then lay out how it doesn't have to be a mess. And I have some thoughts that I've already shared with this leader about a process. Just to give an example of why it doesn't have to be a mess, let's take the issue of how many ballots it would take. You know, I've seen people who want the open convention. I don't want particularly an open convention. I want a process that leads to success. And that can be open but organized to maximize the chances of success. I think there are ways of showcasing the alternatives which do not bruise anybody and give a national audience for some possibly powerful speeches. Okay. No big breakthrough from me on, and I'm not in favor of a debate. Okay. But when it comes to balloting, somebody saying however many ballots it takes. No, the Democrats have to look a lot better than that. They got to come out of this looking like $1 million. And the best way to do that is to settle it as fast as you want. And you could settle it on the first ballot if that's the optimal way, rather than having one or two or whatever, where people do wrangle. Some people drop out and throw their support to another candidate. I don't know, maybe. But if you have early on ranked choice voting processed by some good computerized system, you can crank out a result of this is the winner, chosen by these delegates in a legitimate way as the voice of the Democratic Party. So if it's true that there's no real difficulty in getting to a good result, just got to set it up, that can at least eliminate a bogus reason for, well, we got to stick with Biden. If we should stick with Biden, it should only be because there really is nothing that will make us more likely to succeed. Now, the fact is, my gut tells me that we are more likely to succeed if Biden steps down. I am just stuck on the fact that 72% of Americans believe that Biden is too old and too disabled by age to serve as president. And that debate, that number was already disturbingly high before the debate, but then it moved up considerably to 72%. It's hard for me to believe that the burden of people thinking that as they go in to cast their ballot and choose between a guy they think is unfit because of his age and a guy who may be unfit because, well, whatever they see about him. It shouldn't be any issue, but realistically, I think a lot of that 72%, a meaningful chunk, is going to go check the box for Trump or stay home. I don't, it's hard for me to imagine that if we came out of a well-organized process with Gretchen Whitmer or Newsom, or Kamala Harris, having chosen by the convention in an unbruising fashion, it's hard for me to believe that they wouldn't grab more of the American public, because what Trump has become has really, I think, been repugnant to a majority of Americans. I still do believe that. But that 72%, that's not something people ignore either. Even if they're wrong, the fact that they, at this moment, believe that. So I would have this leader going out and broadcasting that idea that, no, we can do this. We don't have to even work up a sweat. We can organize a process that gets us a group of contenders. We can create showcases where they introduce themselves. We can create a convention in which we go through the process of getting a majority of the convention behind the chosen nominee, with these delegates acting as the surrogates of the whole Democratic base, because it's too late to run primaries. But this should be fine. These are good Democrats. They've been elected because they're good Democrats. But of course, first, Biden needs to choose to withdraw. I do believe that he should, and I suspect that there's a problem standing in the way of that, which has to do with Biden not being a perfect person. I still think it might go either way, but there's a way in which he seems dug in. And if you believe that we should do whatever we can do to maximize the chance that democracy will prevail in this election, and if one believes that the best scenario for achieving that is for Biden to very gracefully bow out and facilitate the unfolding of the optimal process to choose the standard bearer. But it's a bit of a difficult situation when there's a real chance that, whether rightly or wrongly, and I don't say that I'm sure, I mean, he may have insight into how he really can overcome the problems of that 72%. I suspect that it's not insight, but that it's got something to do with the human imperfections of a guy who's got a lot of pride. And so I would have the leader I'm addressing actually try to utilize the totality of the situation, the ways and the reasons for which he might be dug in, and to take this knowledge that really there's a pretty surefire way to come to a pretty good result. I'm imagining that Biden, like a lot of people that I hear and read about, who think that, oh, it's going to be such a mess, where there's no guarantee we'll come up with anything better, and we might, tear the Democratic Party apart. We've had factions before that didn't reconcile well enough, soon enough. Bernie and Hillary and Teddy Kennedy and Carter, and we've got a history of undermining. Okay. He may stay in the race, and therefore, whatever we do, we got to weigh, let's not do damage to this guy, because nobody's going to push him out of the race. But maybe the leader that I'm imagining can help him take himself out of the race if it's judged that that really is the best way of maximizing a chance of keeping Trump out of the presidency. And part of that would be to show that there is indeed a process that can be devised without requiring genius of engineering to produce a result that we can be pretty confident will be at least okay and acceptable and maybe attractive to the bulk of the American people, who I think simply need to be comfortable with an alternative to Donald Trump. That's my belief. So I think that this leader should try to approach Joe Biden, with a message which has two parts. One that calls attention to there isn't a problem. The alternative to you staying on the ticket is something else that you can rest pretty comfortable, would be a pretty good move for the Democrats. But the other one might be geared toward dealing with what I imagine is the ego problem of the president. I think he's a wonderful human being, but this is not the first episode to make me think that there are also some issues. Who doesn't have issues? I think that this decision, whether or not to pull out, engages with one of his issues. And what I would do is I would say to the president, if I were this leader and I could get access to this president, and I think it is possible, if not face to face, then through another process, this leader could get something to the president. If I were the keeper of Joe Biden's legacy and history, I would say what you should do to protect your legacy. You can guarantee you're going to look great in history if you take yourself off the ticket now. Whether you could have won or you couldn't have won, you're going to cement the record of being the guy who beat Donald Trump, and probably was the only guy who could have, as it turned out. And then putting in a very creditable first term, particularly in the domestic arena, so that people are going to say, look what this guy was able to do under these circumstances. The most productive few years of a Democratic presidency since LBJ and the Great Society or something like that. A real achievement. And you rallied the free world to turn back a Russian fascist dictator in his naked aggression. You've got a good place in history. But if you stay on the ticket and it turns out that was a mistake, or it looks like it was a mistake, there goes your whole legacy. That will be your legacy, that you sacrificed the survival of American democracy because you wanted to stay on the ticket. Not the look I would want for you if I'm the keeper of Joe Biden's legacy and history. I'd say quit while you're ahead. There is a good chance that that is, in fact, the right thing to do. And you also can be pretty sure that we can create a process which gets us to a result that history will think of as a good move that you serve the nation once again by showing how different you are from Donald Trump. Everything is about Donald Trump with Donald Trump, but where you put the nation first. That will actually be the maraschino cherry on top of the legacy you've already achieved. So that little piece that I think should be accentuated right now, in which this leader declares, and whenever appropriate, shows that there's no problem with getting a good result. It doesn't have to be a mess. We can design it to not be a mess. Avoid the debate thing where they go after each other. Positive statements. Every one of them a good campaign speech. Every one of them advancing the Democratic cause. Not fighting against each other, fighting against Trump and the Trump party and the force of fascism that's taken over the American right. That is good. People will tune in. They want to see how good is Gretchen Whitmer, and is this governor of Pennsylvania a guy that I could be comfortable having as president? And meanwhile, they're hearing all these things about why the Democrats need to defeat, while the American people need to rise up and support the Democratic standard bearer to preserve American democracy. Biden should be disabused of the notion that it's him or a chaos. I expect that he believes that. I don't know what he believes on that subject, but my bet is he believes that. And partly that belief may be, as we say, motivated belief. I alone can do it is, a way that the ego on the other side has expressed it. Maybe there's motivation to think that there is no alternative to me for the Democrats. Even acknowledging, as Biden does, the existential threat that Trump represents. Everything else really needs to be swept away. Is just, how do you defeat Trump? And this leader can sort of maybe help this president keep that in focus, that the good of the nation, the good of his legacy, both are behind the option of this unselfish gesture where he puts the nation first because he honors his oath. He's the guy that didn't want these powers of a dictator the Supreme Court just gave him. So if I were this leader, I would seek a person-to-person, face-to-face meeting. I might rally some of my colleagues to request collectively that the president grant me such an audience. Maybe that's not a proper thing to do. I'm imagining doing it. And if it is not possible to get that kind of a face-to-face meeting, and it's easy to imagine that because it's not clear that anybody has had access to Joe Biden to pitch a way of looking at things in this kind of a way. But there's an alternative, and that is to write it up, some kind of a statement to Joe Biden that shows there's this good alternative, makes the case that this is the best thing for him to do for himself, his place in history, and to propose a process whereby he, the president of the United States, in handing the baton to new leadership, plays a role that makes the whole thing look really good. It dramatizes for the country not only Biden's goodness, but the goodness of the Democratic Party and the importance of defeating Donald Trump, because it shows what he represents. That document can be written up, and I think it could be 2.5, 3 pages. I think you could say everything that needed to be said, and if that's too long, you could. I think that's probably about the right length, but you could make it shorter. And then maybe have one's group of colleagues say, Mr. President, we respectfully request that you read this document that so-and-so is conveying to you. We all love this country, and this looks like our best way of serving it. Sketch that line. Okay, that's dealing with the first part of the double whammy, the Biden debate that makes it seem at least possible, and my gut tells me probable, that the best course for us to take is for Biden to step down. Oh, and by the way, the idea that the essential thing is winning the presidential election. There shouldn't be any presumption that Kamala Harris is or should be the replacement. The job isn't to find a presidential succession as the Constitution has it if a president dies in office. No, the challenge is to field the most powerful ticket that gives you the best chance of preserving what's really sacred and that's at stake in this election. It's way beyond the egos of any particular candidates or the relationships of people with any particular. It's just a matter of how do we save the country? If Biden steps down, should Kamala Harris replace him? Yes. If that's the best way to, maximizes the probability of defeating Donald Trump. But not if it's not. So nothing should be done as you set this thing up that makes it more likely for Kamala Harris to be the replacement, unless she's in fact the one that gives us the best chance of keeping the powers of the presidency out of the hands of this would-be fascist dictator and thug. Same with every other potential candidate. It should be a level playing field in which the winner is the one that we assess is the most likely to win. Not that we know how everything's going to play out, but you can never do any better than make the judgment you can make. I've given my reasons for thinking that the candidate who would have the greatest probability of winning is Gavin Newsom. I could be wrong. There are going to be 3,000 delegates. They're going to hear what they're going to hear. They're going to think what they're going to think. They're going to feel what they feel. And collectively, they're going to come down on whoever they think has the best chance. That's fine with me. Biden shouldn't choose it. Nobody should choose it. It involves all of us trying to judge future scenarios, as difficult as that may be. But that is the task. That is what we got to do. Whatever will work best. Now, on that second part of the double whammy, what the court handed down on Monday about presidential immunity. I'm not going to, somebody could do a very nice presentation of quotations of what really responsible deeply respectable representatives of the American constitutional system have said about this decision, including, with some remarkable degree of force, some words from dissenting judges. Sotomayor on this decision is scathing. Let me jump to the question that I would be wanting this leader to address on this Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court has shown itself to be an enemy of the rule of law. That is a crisis. The American constitutional order has been built on a structure in which the judiciary and the Supreme Court play an important role. This court is not even trying to play that role anymore in a legitimate fashion. And that can be shown in a whole host of ways. There is a political moment here to strike. It's created by, first of all, the poll numbers, which show that the Supreme Court is held in positive regard, or whatever the phrase is, by a mere 39% of the American people. A substantial drop from how it was not many years ago. This is a remarkable and dangerous development. The way I put it, and I can make a case that this is true, is that the court is no longer in any way a fair arbiter of the law and the Constitution. It is a component of a political side in the American struggle for power, which is patently serving that side rather than seeking to apply justice to the various issues that arise in a society like ours, from abortion to gerrymandering to bribery to gun regulations. A substantial case can be made going back more than a decade that this court is not functioning at all like a court, but is really the opposite. It is a partisan misapplication, pretending to do the job of a court, but really quite manifestly serving as an ally of a political force. And not just any political force. A political force that is really more dark and destructive and broken than any major political party in American history. That's why I say that the Supreme Court is now occupied territory, controlled by a majority that represents a force of, there are various words that can be used here. Let's say fascism is applicable. The plutocracy is applicable. The theocracy is applicable. It is an alliance of things that generally ally in fascistic forces. And they are not honest. They manipulate, and they lie and manipulate, and they get their support by fooling people about what they're about. And the Supreme Court is now part of that. And it can be shown not only in these decisions that you can trace from Citizens United to Shelby overturning voting rights and on and on and on. Dobbs? You can show it. And you can show that it's really lousy law. That's what shows the pretense. I mean, these guys, graduates of Harvard and Yale Law School, they're not stupid, but this is bad stuff that they put out. Inconsistent stuff. All that's consistent is that they're serving this political force. Oh, and you can prove that they've been put on the bench by that same force. Anyway, I could go on about making the case. But I think that what this leader should begin to put out into the world are statements like, this court is illegitimate. This court has forfeited the authority that we have traditionally, to our credit for the most part, accorded to the Supreme Court. It's come to the point where the protection of the rule of law requires declaring to the country, this court is illegitimate. This court is illegitimate. A couple of word issues that I would want this leader, if he talked about this court, that he not use the word ideological to describe it. I keep on hearing on TV people say, the court handed down this thing 6-3. I'm talking about this abomination last Monday, along ideological lines. Now, to me, the idea of an ideology involves that you've sort of sought some kind of understanding, and you've arrived at a point of view after working on developing an understanding. So you have a system of belief which more or less hangs together, whether it has flaws in it or not. So, for example, a Milton Friedman who believed in the market system, he had an ideology. He wasn't interested in advancing the interests of the plutocracy. He was a guy who actually believed that that was the ticket to freedom. He was able to make a case, though it was excluded too much, according to me. But he made a case for free to choose. This Republican Party, this Republican majority on the Supreme Court doesn't have an ideology. They're not consistent. They're pretending to believe things. An ideologue actually believes them. I recall, I don't remember the details, but back about 3 years ago, they had, or maybe 4, this Republican-appointed majority delivered opinions one day after another, taking an opposite side one day from another in terms of what position to take on a supposed principle. And now we also know, and this leader can make judgments about exactly what is to be presented to the American people to make them aware that we've got a Supreme Court problem here, that it's illegitimate. We got to stop undermining. We got to start undermining their authority, because that's going to be necessary to have the political support to doing anything about this crisis where a force of fascism is taking control of the Supreme Court. It's got to be an alarm sounded. First of all, this court is illegitimate. And the word ideology provides a kind of legitimacy. It gives a certain respect to a court that doesn't deserve it. Their decisions are poor by constitutional standards. It's not a conservative court that takes certain kinds of ideas and values and uses them to fashion an honest way of answering the constitutional and legal issues before them. And we find out that the same forces that corporatist and the money power, you can see how the money power has created this court over the course of 40 years. They've been working assiduously to groom and find the people that will do their bidding if they get elevated to the court, find their Gorsuches and their Kavanaughs who are in these lower levels and choose them to be on the list from the Federalist Society, so that presidents like Trump or W, who don't really care that much about any of this, will appease that part of their fascist coalition. The plutocracy gets their corporatist John Roberts as Chief Justice. You can see how the court has been created. You can see in the decisions how this bogus argument is used to paper over a partisan decision, not ideological. It's partisan. Very different way of seeing it, because it's not legitimate for the court to be a partisan. It can be legitimate for them to have a point of view. I mean, Justice, what was his name? Douglas, the liberals, justice of progressive decision making. He really believed in some values. He wasn't just trying to grab power for the powerful and wealth for the wealthy and impose on everybody the views of a few. He was trying to make what he saw as a better America. Conservative justices can decide similarly what they think makes for a better America when the situation's ambiguous enough. That's not what this court's doing. It's illegitimate. And the sounding of the alarm is the first, let's say, opening bell in the campaign that's going to need to be waged after this presidential election. This is a longer-term project. But I don't think it can be so long-term that we can depend on the passing and implementing the measures that we think need to be implemented to bring this runaway court under control. I don't think we got that kind of time. Look at all the damage that they are doing right now. I mean, a court that would hand down this decision about presidential immunity, what wouldn't they do? I follow all this stuff very closely. I listen to Andrew Weissman and Neil Katyal and Joyce Vance and Glenn Kirshner and all those people who are so good at explaining things. Nobody took seriously at all the possibility that the Supreme Court, after giving Trump all that delay, would actually say that there is merit to his claim of presidential immunity. But they lay down something which, as I say, we could quote even Judge Ludig, the lion of conservative jurisprudence a few years back. I forget what his quote is, but he thinks this is an abomination, overturning the American constitutional order that he loves. And Sotomayor and Jackson, justices are raising the alarm also. So the American people need to hear this alarm really loud and clear. First of all, even though it's setting the stage for an eventual confrontation with the need to do something about this in a timely way, which I believe has got to do with being much more challenging and aggressive, ultimately, than just, I think there may be some defiance called for in the future. On some point, in some conceivable future moment, challenging to bring to a head the issue of what this Supreme Court has become. But in the meanwhile, it is clearly also a part of the presidential election. Biden delivered a very fine statement. He doesn't want the power to commit crimes as president, and we shouldn't let Trump get that power either. But the court did what nobody imagined that they would do. It is such an abomination that alarm bells, and so I would like to have this leader leading the raising of this alarm, putting it front and center, and using it as a means to alert also the American electorate to the danger of putting power in the hands of a guy who's already shown what his willingness to abuse his powers, committing crimes, and now has been given a free pass, virtually a free pass, by the Supreme Court. So it's a campaign issue. And I think it would be kind of ironic if this abomination is so beyond what is acceptable that it ends up being self-defeating for this fascist power. I'd like to see that happen. This leader maybe can help it make it happen. And the Democratic nominee, Biden or whoever else, can help make that happen. The things the Supreme Court did is it made it possible. And I talked about this last time out when I didn't really understand what an abomination of the Supreme Court had just done. But I talked about the possibility that there will be hearings in Judge Chutkan's court, which means that even though all that delay prevents a trial from ever happening before the election, we really have a chance, a good chance, I gather, that we are going to have a bunch of hearings, hours and hours of hearings over a certain non-trivial period of time with witnesses testifying under oath that's going to amount to a mini trial. That, lo and behold, like a miracle from the heavens, this very same stroke that the Supreme Court has done has required Judge Chutkan to inquire into, well, what is indictable in a president by these criteria? What's an official? What's not an official? Well, we got to sort this out. And the way we sort this out is we expose to the American people the picture of what Donald Trump did. And we expose it, probably, I think they're talking about it, people are saying it should happen by fall, like September, after the conventions. If you've got this being exposed in the last weeks before the election, wow, ironic. So in a way, this decision sort of brings into kind of a vivid light. It's not that complicated. It's not like, quid pro quo when it comes to bribery. It shouldn't be too hard to show how to corrupt decision that is for people like Alito and Thomas to. But this thing that the court laid down, the way it's made, presumption of immunity, anything like it is immune if Trump called upon the Justice Department to commit fraud with a state legislature to overturn an election. Oh, the president's allowed to talk to the Justice Department. That can't be a crime. Oh, what a mess. This is a presidential issue because the Judge Chutkan will be showing that this former president is completely willing to commit serious crimes. And then this Supreme Court is saying there's nothing to stop him. And then people use the word king to say America doesn't have a king. Well, here on the 4th of July. That is the way that they put it in the Declaration of Independence. They were worried about George III and his tyrannical powers. So it's understandable that we Americans would talk about it in terms of king, but we are 21st century Americans. The issue isn't whether Donald Trump is a king. The word should be dictator, tyrant. Because we don't see kings the way we see the way they saw George III. We like to go over to England and watch the changing of the guard. We televise the coronation of King Charles III, and we just get off on that. And we've got we got other people who are the king and queen of Denmark or the Netherlands or something like that. We like all that stuff. It's not a king that we don't like. We Americans have learned not to like dictators. And that's what Trump really represents. He's no king. He's of no royal blood. He's the crudest man we've ever seen. He's like Putin. So don't use the word ideology, say partisan. Don't use the word king, say dictator. I don't want to use strong man. That people like strength enough, but they don't like dictators. I think I'll stick with that. It's an issue. The powers of a dictator have been put by the Supreme Court into the hands of the president. And we got one side that says, that's not the American way, and I dissent, said Joe Biden about that decision. Whoever the Democratic nominee is has to continue to dissent from that and use that message about the Supreme Court and don't put the power to put more such partisans on the court who are willing to do these things. This is not a legitimate court. Trump helped to make it so. They're trying to help him become president again. Don't you let them. All right. Those are the two messages I can see that to deal with these two things. This court is illegitimate. Awaken the people to that. And begin the question of how do we address this problem with defeat Trump. And on the other crisis, recognize as we calculate what path to take as a party in terms of sticking with Biden or nominating somebody else, including but not necessarily only Kamala Harris. What is the best scenario for going forward? Judged solely by the probability of victory in November. And hopefully, to be able to utilize that argument and the argument that Joe Biden is risking his place in history, and I'm not the first one to say so. This has been in some of the communications about he's risking his legacy if he chooses to stay on the ticket and loses. That even for reasons of ego, it should weigh more heavily on pass the baton, not on taking this risk, which the polls at 72% thinking him unfit. If history sees that in spite of that number, he decided nobody else can do as well, not a good look. So I think that that pitch should be made. Biden has to make his judgment. If he stays on the ticket, we all have to make him as strong as we can. And if he takes himself off the ticket, we should support a process that leads to the best possible replacement. And that makes Biden look really good. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. Now, I guess if you'll let me just sort of collect myself. And that's the end of the opening move here. My best effort to advise what a leader on the Democratic stage, or it could be somebody who's not a Democrat, on the national stage, what can a leader do in view of the very troubling things that have happened lately, which seem to make it less likely than it looked before that we will defeat Donald Trump. I'm going to see if I can turn this thing off. Sorry about that. And a Supreme Court decision, but simply one which caps a variety of Supreme Court decisions, like getting rid of the Chevron principle and defining bribery in such a way as to make Alito's and Thomas's corruption look okay. There's a whole bunch of decisions that can be used to paint a picture of a serious, I would say unprecedented crisis about the Supreme Court. I'm aware of the terrible decisions that have been made on behalf of white racism and Dred Scott in 1857 and Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and all the corporate corrupt decisions that came down. But I don't think there's ever been a court nearly so corrupt, nearly so lacking in integrity of any important kind as this Supreme Court majority. And it puts us in a position where I think that the question that the American people need to be asking is, what do we do when the Supreme Court has become an enemy of the rule of law? Because that is the situation in which we find ourselves. And that needs to be brought to the attention of the American people. We are forced to make a choice between two unappealing paths. One is we continue to play by the rules entirely, which means that the Supreme Court can continue to do what it's been doing to American society, making these kinds of phony decisions, that they are fed in a way which can be shown by the force that put them on the bench. Sheldon Whitehouse is showing how they create bogus history and bogus precedents for justifying partisan decisions. All this can be shown. And then the question arises, what do we do? My watching the good guys over the past 30 years tells me we are far more likely to err in the direction of not being bold enough. I think that's been continuous for ever since Clinton got elected and they started trying to destroy him. Not being bold enough, never being too bold. Really, never, whether it's that or what Bush did with the war on terror or getting swift boated or the across-the-board obstructionism of Obama or how Biden has dealt with the Republican Party that's acted so abominably since he took office, so obviously indefensibly. We simply have never been bold enough. So I think that the question, what do we do when we discover that the Supreme Court, which our rules say gets the last word on every conflict, is an enemy of the rule of law? I think that we got to start thinking about, how do we challenge their authority? I mean, it's one thing to put more justices on the court. It takes time, a lot of time. And changing the Constitution to eliminate lifelong tenure by putting, term limits takes even more time. Good things to do, maybe, so we don't get in this position again. We should never have gotten in this position in the first place, except for that liberal America was sleeping through the process by which the other side was creating this court. So I think a certain amount of boldness is required here to find ways of challenging, but not before the election, because any time of kind of challenge, which is really, unfortunately, involves, in a way, assaulting the rule of law because you're trying to defend it from this court. Not something is probably politic to attempt to do until we've elected will have the wisdom and moral commitments to find the right ways forward in taking power away from this fascist force on the Supreme Court. But I think boldness is called for, greater boldness. The leader with whom I'm sharing these thoughts will take the boldest moves that seem to offer the greatest chance of being positively impactful on the dilemma in which we find ourselves, where the survival of American democracy has been threatened more and more visibly over the years, but never so frighteningly as in the past week. I'm not going to talk about Project 2025, but elect Donald Trump president? Hey, America, take a look at this. It's not the American system our founders intended to give us. Okay, moving along to, all of this has got to do with a larger context in my thinking, which I call a better human story, which has got to do with the forces that are at work in the human world, in which it can be shown that there have been, as an inevitable byproduct of becoming a civilization creating species, which our species did some 10,000 years ago, there is inevitably two coherent forces that form in the world and move through it that can be shown, one of which is destructive and that inevitably emerges out of the step onto the path of civilization, and one of which is consistently constructive, consistently works in the direction of making the human world better, I mean. And that these two inevitably emerge with civilization. It can be shown. And I spent my life developing it as somebody trained as a social scientist and integrative thinker with a background that's, pretty ideally suited for doing such a thing. From the time, I grew up with a particular social science thinker father to an education involving Harvard, the University of Chicago, Yale, and the University of California, and then into developing this better human story. And it is helpful. The first hour of this podcast was spent on looking at the state of play in the battle between democracy and fascism as we, in the wake of a couple of developments, one having to do with the election, one having to do with how the law, so-called, is being laid down with authority and power by a Supreme Court that's the enemy of the rule of law. And that can be illuminated in that larger context, I want to say. The battle between democracy and fascism is best be seen in terms of how these forces operate in the human world. And what I was trying to do in that is to come up with a couple of stratagems about how do you fortify the power of the democracy and the rule of law, which is, say, the constructive force in its ongoing battle against the force of fascism, which is a destructive force. And you can see that by studying fascism over the past century, which I have. It is a version of what inevitably arose with civilization, inevitably, which leads to some understandings that I've put together and that drives me because I actually believe some things about its validity intellectually as a way of illuminating not everything that goes on in the human world, but some basic things that are really important to see, like ways in which civilization has always been out of control in some ways, and the challenge for us is to bring it under control, and that task can be illuminated by understanding what it is we're up against. And that book up there is called What We're Up Against. That book describes, as best I was able to do in 14 years, in a book published by the University of California, laying out that it is inevitable that the step onto the path of civilization would have major implications, unwished for consequences that have escaped people's notice, but can be shown to be inevitable. And that puts some important things in a wholly different light. And then my purpose in doing this whole video project has been, the whole reason I'm doing it is that I have not succeeded in getting this understanding out into the world. And I truly do believe that it could have a beneficial impact on the question of whether we as a species on this planet get our act together well enough and soon enough to survive for the long haul, or whether we destroy ourselves. And that possibility looks to me like 50-50, whether we make it or we don't make it in the next not so many generations. And I think I can plausibly show that it is a toss-up, and we're not going to be able to just muddle through indefinitely. We do either have to get it together or we're going to blow it. I think I can demonstrate that. And I actually do believe that if I could get this way of understanding things that began with that, a life-changing moment for me, and built in the half century plus since then into more. If I could get that out there well enough into our thinking, people would see what we got to do more clearly. One example of that is that because I see the nature of the forces and how they operate in the human world, to the extent that I do, I'm not claiming that. I mean, I've got real questions about a variety of things, but I saw enough so that back in the 90s, I could see this fascist force rising. And in 2004, I saw something that, again, I got blown away about the danger that we then were in 2004, 20 years ago. And I function as something of a Cassandra in the liberal world, putting out, this is what I see developing here, taking over there, threatening the continuity of the values we hold sacred in the American system. And I was something of a Cassandra, Cassandra being the princess in the royal family of Troy, who could see the disastrous future that threatened her city in all of its horror. But though she could see it, she couldn't convince anybody else that it was there till it was too late. So I think it's important to be able to see the whole. Seeing things whole actually illuminates the parts. And the election between Joe Biden or whoever and Donald Trump can be seen as a major showdown in a larger context. And that context, well, it expands, first of all, that there's a global thing that's going on, which I really wish I understood better about why fascism has been gaining power on a global basis. I'm very open to being educated on that. I've written about it. I got some interesting things to say, but I really don't see what's going on at a global level that would explain that you can see some of the same things happening in Turkey and Brazil and India around the same time, and the United States. But in any event, I've looked more deeply into the specific dynamics of the American battle between democracy and fascism. And I think I have a basic understanding of most of the bold outlines. The main question that remains unanswered for me is almost a psychological question. Well, it is a psychological question, which is interesting because psychology was my first long suit from the mid-teens until, well, certainly through college. I was deeply immersed, and I went at Harvard as an undergraduate. My dissertation was a book they said was publishable, A Psychology of Heroic Tragedy, looking at the Greeks and Shakespeare and their dramas and what the psychological dimensions of it were. I was very influenced by Freud, somewhat influenced by Jung, and I studied pretty much all the rest of the thinkers, Adler and Rank, and even Carl Rogers. That was kind of who I was. And when I dropped out of graduate school, I earned my living being an intern psychotherapist in the Alameda County mental health system. So I kind of came onto the scene and got that kind of life-changing vision as a guy who I went on to the University of Chicago to get and studied clinical psych until I dropped out. At the University of Chicago, as well as social thought. So, and then this thing happened, and I see how how there are destructive forces that arise, and how it makes people more broken, and I studied that in some depth. I wrote a sequel to that, which has got to do with healing the wounds that drive us to war. I've been a psychologist, in probably better than any of the other disciplines that I've put together in my seeing things whole efforts. But the thing about what's going on in America is most puzzling to me, in spite of my trying very hard to understand it, is the psychology of how you take good and intelligent people and make them into supporters of this of today's Trumpian party. I mean, I got to know these people as a talk radio host. So I have a perspective on them from 10 years of hundreds of hours of conversation. So I know the level of intelligence that's out there. A lot of intelligent people and good people. And I don't understand how you get people who talk to me like that in the 90s to be ready to vote for Donald Trump and the Trump party now. But however that was done, I do see that the propagandists pulled off this magic trick. Incredible achievement. Even in a free society, they were able to take intelligent, good people and turn them into supporters of something the opposite of the values that they said they held sacred, and to believe things that you would think an intelligent person could never believe. They pulled it off, however it was. What I don't understand isn't really so germane to the fact that you can see that there's a way in which various forces of brokenness have come into alliance and taken over one of the sides of America's power system, power as relates to the political system. In other words, we have a two-party system. It's interesting to me that the founders didn't envision the role of parties, and they created a system which I think has an inherent dynamic. It's going to give you a two-party system. So and we've had that since Adams versus Jefferson, when Washington, the unanimous choice, stepped down, and has continued more or less continuously up to the present moment. But now we've got one of those has been taken over by a force of brokenness. And in my Better Human story, I feel like part of the way it can help us to survive for the long haul is to recognize what we're up against, which is there really is a coherent force that you can see operating in the world in a variety of ways. You can see it in a variety of ways too. And that's a whole topic on itself, which I've done once before. You can see it, first of all, if you can find some particular entity, like a political party or a nation, where everything it does and says seems destructive. To get that kind of consistent result, you have to postulate that there's something that's controlling it. And I have a way of conceptualizing what that something is. And then a second way, and that's actually the first way that I saw it. A second way is to go back in the unfolding of human history to trace that crucial crossing of a threshold where, as a species, we stepped onto the path of civilization, where that path is just where civilization is defined as those societies created by a species, and here comes conceptually the core thing, that has extricated itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically, and it has done so by inventing its own way of life. What I claim to prove is that any species anywhere that does that will inevitably traverse a path as destructive and tormented as has been the human path over the last 10,000 years. where the first full-blown civilizations, for example, after 5,000 years of that path of civilization, on the emergence of cities and empires, wherever that happened, after, say, 5,000 years, give or take, I mean, different times, whether it's the Nile Valley or the Tigris Euphrates or Ganges or the Yellow River in China, et cetera, et cetera. Wherever it happens, when the full-blown civilization emerges, what you basically find is you've got these warlord types, these gangster types, these tyrant types, these rulers who are dominating empires that have been formed out of the disorder that is inevitably unleashed when a species leaves the niche in which it was evolved biologically, which means it leaves a natural order which has been evolved biologically to make sure the interactions among the elements are consistent with the viability, the synergies of the system as a whole. And I lay out that the order that we emerged from after 3.5 billion years, the order that created us, is an order that can be described fundamentally as the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. The perpetuality of it is more fundamental than the nature, red and tooth and claw of it. That's what works for the long haul. What gets its DNA into the future is that which operates synergistically with the system on which it depends for its survival. And we, up until 10,000 years ago, or maybe 12, we were part of that order. We were still in the niche in which we evolved biologically. But because we were the first creatures to have developed the creative intelligence to be able to change the rules in fundamental ways, we extricated, we invented new ways of living and unleashed something, because it was a whole new system when you had civilized societies, a new kind of life form, shaped by the creature's imagined and creative intelligence, not by natural selection, that are interacting with each other with nothing having evolved as an order to make sure that the lions and the zebras and the grass get it on in a synergistic and long-term viable way. We were in a new kind of disorder, a state of anarchy, and then what I can crank out, which I do there, but I also do on my website in briefer ways, betterhumanstory.org, that this disorder leads to a war of all against all. And that war of all against all, combined with all the different directions that the breakthrough into civilization allows cultures to be developed, at least theoretically, all the things that people could invent and then do invent, and all the cultural diversity and everything, it turns out that diversity gets subject to a process of selection, analogous to the Darwinian one, but different, because suddenly there is a war of all against all in a disordered situation where only the cultural options that are able to prevail in such a thing survive and spread. It is inevitable, I say, and I think I prove, that the spirit of the gangster will get a disproportionate say in how civilization evolves. That's the force of brokenness that came into the world with civilization, inevitably, and that we're dealing with today in a particular battlefield, where that force of brokenness has taken over one of America's two political parties. But you can study how that force emerges with civilization. You can see how that war of all against all creates certain kinds of brokenness in people, creates certain kind of brokenness in the societies, can create some, and how if you look at the what caused this and you find the causes of that, you find that brokenness begets brokenness. It's moving through the system. And if you ask, okay, well, given this, what are the consequences of this further down the line? And again, you find that brokenness begets brokenness. So one way of seeing this force of brokenness is to see that there are sometimes there emerge entities in the world, whether political parties or nations or whatever, that seem clearly to have been taken over by something because they always are working to make things worse. And that is what this Republican Party has become. I can't find any exceptions anymore. You could, as this thing was taking over, you could still find, the traditional Republican goodness and the goodness that I found in the conservatives out here. You could find that was still alive. And now it's sort of like this, vestigial goodness in the form of like a Liz Cheney or an Adam Kinzinger and some of these people at Bulwark and Nicole Wallace. I mean, the flood has washed away the bulk of it, and the party is now owned by Donald Trump. It's consistently destructive, whether it's got to do with preferring to bring bogus impeachment charges against a very honest president rather than having any interest in getting anything passed that's actually constructive and advances the American people. It wasn't even considered for a moment, how can we work with this new president that people have hired to help the American people and to advance America into the better America we could be? Not the least bit interested. Wow. That's pretty damn destructive. But that's what they are. And you have to infer there's something behind it, because if every time you flip the coin, it comes up heads, or it comes up every time it comes up tails, there's got to be something that's, weighing the outcome. See, well, there's a way in which a force of brokenness can be seen working in the human world from the beginnings of the wars that become chronic in the beginnings of civilization, the empires, and the way the spirit of the gangster leads to these pharaohs and emperors and like that, having a disproportionate say on the human future, so that 5,000 years into the civilizing process, you find most people are being enslaved, or at least dominated and exploited by a few, and in which you can tell from the remains that they're not in good condition compared to the nourishment of hunter-gatherers. It wasn't a path that human beings chose. And so when I say that I think this could help us have a beneficial impact, what I claim I can show is that the ugliness that we see in human history, the human history is not a reflection of human nature, that there's a selective process which mandates inevitably that if you're a creature that steps out of that order, you're going to have this spirit of the gangster play a disproportionate role. It's going to create an uglier face than the species is born to have. And I believe I can show that in a whole variety of ways. That book of mine, let's see if I quickly summon that up. Well, that wasn't the right way to do it. I see. Not very expert at this stuff. Okay. This can be described as if there was an inevitable war of all against all and an inevitable selection for the ways of power. This is the way that people are going to get broken. And I go through 4 different dimensions of what that necessarily implies. And that the people then become they're not only broken, but they become agents of brokenness. You can see how it happens in a variety of ways. And it's suggestive of a much larger picture. When you get people, I mean, you look at the lust for power. What is it that makes some people lust for power? It ain't good things. Insatiable greed. What is it that makes some people insatiably greedy, that they can never have enough? Again, not good things. Being subjected to kinds of brokenness that lead to the person having a psychological form of brokenness, which then leads them to behaving in the world in ways which perpetuate the brokenness. So my favorite way of showing the existence of a force that consistently works to make things worse, a coherent force that works in the human world through time, is the one that looks at the outbreak of the war of all against all, of the selective process that inevitably emerges, and then at the brokenness that inevitably inflicts on people who live in that system where things are out of control, where the systemic dynamic, rather than human desire and human choice, are having a big role in choosing how societies are going to be organized. There's a selective process. Only the ways that can prevail survive and spread. You can see that throughout history. So it follows from that any creature that creates civilization, that takes that fateful step, meaning on some other planet, life evolves in the way the selection process works biologically, whether it's DNA or they got some other system on some other planet, who knows? But there'll be a selective process which will create viable creatures, because only viable creatures get their DNA into the future. And any planet that develops a species that can do what we did and then that does it, and I doubt that would be so rare. Who knows? But there are billions and billions of galaxies and billions of stars in each galaxy and billions of planets around those stars. I mean, it's just so many that there must be a lot of them. And according to the logic that I present in this book, every place, every creature that on any planet that makes that fateful step onto the path of civilization is going to have a civilization that's driven by a systemic dynamic. It's going to select both the psychologies and the organizations and the technologies that enable a society to prevail in a war of all against all. It's not a function of the creature's nature. So one of the implications of that vision, that theory, which I say holds water, from which there is, according to me, no escape, there is going to be a selection for certain kinds of things on the basis of what can prevail when there's an inevitable struggle for power that's going to emerge. And I've got ways of showing how the ways of power inevitably spread. That's that's what the actual parable of the tribes is a way of demonstrating that once you introduce this kind of pathology anywhere in the system, it becomes inevitable that the ways of power, one way or another, will spread throughout the system. You can Google my last name, Schmuckler, and then the phrase, imagine a group of tribes, and you'll come upon that passage. It's from that book. And I don't see any way out of that. That there are just certain options that are available to the rest of the societies. And eventually, the ways of power spread throughout the system because of the lack of order in that system, which is why we got to create a different kind of order. One we haven't done yet. We've made some progress over 10,000 years, but not so much progress that the Russian dictator in Moscow can't act like we're still in the basic disorder that we were in when the emperors first arose with the big cities and enslaved the masses. Civilization has been out of control for a long time. In order to bring it under control, we got to understand why it's been out of control. And to see that it's been out of control, one way to see it is that if you go 5,000 years down the path that we stepped onto 10,000 years ago, you find the mass of people are not living very good lives, worse than hunter-gatherers. If you look at the situation of the average person in these empires that first emerged, and you look at the lives of the average people in hunting-gathering societies from 5,000 years all the way back, I think it's clear you'd choose to be the hunter-gatherer, not the guy who's most likely a slave. Hunter-gatherer people are not, they're living in egalitarian societies. There's no tyrants. The tyrants are not particularly the best people. Hunting-gathering societies don't have rulers in general at all. People are free to pursue their lives on their terms without some coercive system exploiting them. But 5,000 years later, you think people chose that? As I recall from my studies, the evidence of human remains from hunting-gathering peoples and then also from average people in the average situation in civilized societies, from the beginnings of the cities until close to modern times. I'm not sure how close. The path to civilization for at least the first 5,000 years leads to worse nutrition for the average person than hunting-gathering people had. And I'm not sure if it still pertains to, say, Europe in 1500. I wouldn't be surprised if it does, but I don't remember if I know that. But the path, it's not something people would have chosen had they been given a choice. And what I'm suggesting is there's an inevitable systemic dynamic that takes away human choice. And you got to overcome that systemic dynamic if we're going to have a chance to get a future that we would want. A future, for example, in which democracy and the rule of law, which is way better for people than fascism, prevails. This is a contemporary showdown between the two versions of our time of these two ancient forces. One where people create worlds that, as best they can, correspond to their needs. Like we can imagine hunting-gathering societies were pretty much free to do. And then the unleashing of this social evolutionary dynamic that mandates that the spirit of the gangster will get a disproportionate say. And people have to live in societies that were dictated by a selective process for the ways of power. The ways of power. There we get back to the Supreme Court. The job of the Supreme Court is not to express the ways of power. It's not to be a continuation of the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, which is the principle that emerges to dictate to a large extent. I don't know what percent, but big deal. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And that's what this presidential election is about. And that's what the problem of the Supreme Court is about. People have written about this Supreme Court that they really are not about making their arguments as legitimate as possible. They're not about, one of the things which people have pointed to about the decision they handed down on Monday is that ordinarily, and I've heard this, maybe 3 times already, ordinarily the Supreme Court, in a case like this, like in the Nixon tapes case, they'll go do everything they can to come down with as much unanimity as possible, because part of their task is to bring things together and to say, this is what we can agree is what is justice. But they say, not this court. With this court, it's all, we got the power and we're going to do it. And we're going to stick it to you. So instead of the court coming out into the public with the kind of unanimity that said to Richard Nixon, you got to give the special prosecutor the tapes, because what's at stake for the country has to do with issues of keeping the integrity of the whole constitutional rule of law order. So you got to give them the tapes, and that led quickly to, by a few steps, to Nixon resigning in 1974. But instead, this court hands down this patently fascistic order of creating not a king but a dictator. Presumption of immunity, so that you can't even be prosecuted for the naked abuse of the Justice Department, the way Trump tried to do with having his Justice Department send bogus letters of lying about finding fraud and getting state legislatures to back off from certifying their legitimate electors. Oh, you can't do that because we presume. That's the one thing apparently that they took off the table. I think it's probably wrong for Judge Chutkan to be so bold as to challenge that. I think we got to keep the challenges till after the election, as I said before. But it's bogus. It's not okay for the president to do that. They say you can't even look at his motives. Well, his motives was to hang on to power after the people, using their legitimate constitutional power, said, no, you're out of here. We want to give the power to him. That's supposed to be presumed that he's immune. They've got the power, so they're going to jam it down everybody's face, even when it's completely bogus. And instead of unanimity, you've got people giving decisions like a dissent like Sotomayor, saying, by the logic of this decision, the president, who's the commander-in-chief, therefore acting in his official role, can tell, I guess it's SEAL Team 6, I don't even know exactly who 6 is, but that he could command them to go assassinate his rivals. And because that's one of his core powers, is to be able to talk to these guys and tell them what to do, that's presumed immune, or maybe beyond presumed. It's simply taken off the table. And likewise with taking a bribe to issue a pardon, using the military to effect a coup d'etat. I think those are the 3 things. And she ends with immune, 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 immune. And then she ends the whole thing, at least I think it's the ending of her dissent. I fear for democracy, our democracy. And then I dissent, with the conspicuous absence of the word respectfully. So the fig leaf is off. It is naked struggle for power right now. And that's what she's calling him out for. And she's not being respectful about it. Nor should she. I mean, people are saying that this decision won't stand indefinitely. How do we bring it down? Do we have to play only by the rules? I mean, that grants the court an authority that they should have forfeited. I mean, not just because of these decisions, but the whole corruption, the refusal to recuse and all that. Well, to go back, this is the battle we're engaged in, and it's best understood as the modern version of an age-old battle of humans to try to bring the force of brokenness under control so that our world won't be so terrible. And we Americans actually have not been living in such a terrible world compared to peoples before. That's why it's so hard for us to understand how untrustworthy civilization has been. The destructive force that's been at the heart of it. Because we've been the beneficiaries of the democracy that our founders gave us, which has enabled the needs of human beings to get a lot more expression in creating how the world operates in the realm of power than it was throughout human history before us, civilized history. And we've also been the beneficiaries of a variety of institutional developments, which have greatly empowered our ability to provide people with material comforts and wealth. And part of it is the gift of a market society, which is it's got its problems, as I've spoken of at length. But one of the things it's really great at is providing material in abundance. It generates wealth way better than and we've got science and technology enhancing those things. We got the economic and technological institutions which will allow us to put into people's hands the means to elevate them above mere subsistence, which is a lot of what's been in the past, which is why Malthus, a mere 2+ centuries ago, thought that it would be impossible to raise the material level of the mass of human beings above mere subsistence. It hadn't been that well achieved. I don't know exactly what the figures are. I think that the colonial America was, better than medieval Europe, but the takeoff took place as a market society, and the Industrial Revolution unleashed the ability of human beings to provide more for people. And also the market society came to need that people would become consumers. And we haven't tamed this system at all, but we Americans of even all but the worst poverty, I mean, I'm not sure what the level is, but in general, the overwhelming majority of Americans for some generations has been living a whole lot better for political and economic reasons than people in general did. But that's because we made some progress that is part of the process of bringing the forces of human civilization under control. The market system needs to be brought under better control, and our democracy could use some improvements too. But basically, they were real steps forward, and we've been the beneficiaries. But when we look to the plight of human beings in general, when civilization first emerged in its full-blown fashion in the Nile Valley and the Tigris, Euphrates, and all the rest, we see we can't take for granted that the forces of brokenness won't drive us in directions that make things worse. Because it did it before, and it can do it again. One of the ways it could do it again is if it took the American system of power and made it a lot more like Putin's system in Russia, for example. That's what we're up against. So the ugliness around us is best understood as part of a dynamic that where a destructive force that isn't a function of human nature that would beset any creature that stepped across the threshold into civilization until they could bring that force under control has to be brought under control, and we have not succeeded yet. And in America, which has played a major role, albeit very imperfectly, as leader of the free world in moving things in the better direction, is in danger of flipping from having the helm in the hands of people who are basically committed to forces that make the world better into more like Putin, a force that makes the human world worse. I mean, look at what Putin has done to the world. It's taken the peace that the Europeans worked so hard to create out of the ruins of World War II and set it back a long way, with a lot of nations now feeling under threat that were formerly feeling secure in a way that human societies haven't always felt secure. But the Swedish and the Finns figured out, our victory for international order turns out to have been temporary. The Cold War, which was a contest also between top-down and bottom-up societies when we were the leader of the free world. The Cold War, we won. One assumed it was going to be a permanent victory. Francis Fukuyama writes, the end of history, like liberal democracy, obviously, is now the wave of the future. Well, it's in retreat now. I don't know why. But Russia is now under a fascist dictator. Territory once won can be lost. Excuse me. If we understand that what's at stake here are two coherent forces, excuse me, that have been embattled for millennia, and that take different forms in different times in history, where the battle is joined at different places, like thinking of World War II or the Civil War. I mean, the election is sort of our Gettysburg. I hope it's the high watermark of Trumpian threat to democracy, with the Project 2025 getting washed down the toilet of history with Trump's defeat. But there are battles all over the place here, and they can be understood as manifestations of this larger thing. And it's good to see how the battlefield is shaped. It really has some information. Not only do you see the way the good guys failed to see what's rising on the right, but it could have been beaten back much more easily before it became so strong. And it became so strong because it wasn't seen for what it was. But now we see it. The Supreme Court has made it very hard not to see. We're in danger of falling into a dictatorship. We might be a country that supports not Ukraine, but Putin. And you can see it in a very large and complex play of forces that work in the whole network of cause and effect. And then it takes some macro levels where you get a showdown like our Gettysburg. And then we're going to have to do the equivalent of pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments so that the power of the slave power could be cut off. and a system based on the exploitation of one race by another not rear its head. Pretty depressing how that actually worked out, but that's what they tried to do. History is a bitch. I mean, you can fight and win a civil war, and then still by the mid-1870s, slavery gets reestablished, white supremacy gets reestablished, racial oppression and terror get reestablished where slavery had been. Not exact slavery, but pretty much the economic equivalent for the sharecroppers and all that, the Jim Crow South, and all the lynchings. You couldn't whip a slave, but you could terrorize them with forbidden fruit, or strange fruit, I guess it was called in the song. These battles make clear a larger picture, which I am devoted to trying to get out further into the world. And I'm not succeeding. And I realize that I don't understand exactly why I'm not succeeding, because I can claim, I think with some plausibility, that this integrative vision of the story of humankind puts some important questions into a fundamentally different light. How we understand what kind of creatures we are, I think that's important, and it does have major implications for that. Why our history's been the way it has been, to regard it as, in a sense, not a reflection of the nature of the human being, but what happens to a species that unleashes a destructive force and ends up wounded by the inadvertent but inevitable emergence of a destructive force, injurious force, traumatizing force. Our history and the world that we see around us, how to understand what's going on in Gaza, why Hamas would do what it did, why this fascist clique that unfortunately has been in charge of Israel at this crucial moment, why they have responded the way they've responded. There are answers to these questions. They're complicated, but some of the basic elements are clear, and it brings it into a why we have something like a Putin that emerges out of what looked 30-some years ago like what might become finally Russians living in a democratic order, and now they're in this one where he sends troops in to conquer an innocent people entitled to their autonomy. He sends them in to commit war crimes. He sends them into the meat grinder to die by the tens of thousands as cannon fodder. I guess that's a mixed metaphor, the meat grinder and the cannon fodder. But you get my point. A human monster. If you make a list of the people with the biggest impact on the world right now, human monsters in our general experience of humankind are very few and far between, are way overrepresented among the people with the biggest impact on our world. That's not human nature. We're better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, and that is fortifying. Our history and the world around us that we see now doesn't show us who and what we are. And then in terms of the constructive force, this better human story shows also that there can be seen proof, again, looking at through an evolutionary perspective, that evolution has put it within us, not just this creative intelligence that's gotten us into such trouble. It has put into us certain experiential tendencies that have an evaluative dimension. And some of them lead to a way of finding that the moral dimension is real, important, and life-serving must be honored, can be tuned into as a means of empowering us to protect the good. And the spiritual dimension has been also put into us by evolution in a way that can conclude, I think, conclusively, irresistibly, that the spiritual dimension of experience is there because that has been an impactful experiential thing that has helped our ancestors get their DNA into the future, or it wouldn't be there. Moral and spiritual dimensions are both real, important, and life-serving, can be proven. So what you emerge with out of all that is a way of understanding the human drama that's got a lot of very particular stuff going on. You know, it doesn't take anything out of history. It just puts a clarifying framework on history, which shows what we've been up against since we took that step onto the path of civilization, shows what we got to accomplish if we're not going to be destroyed by the force of brokenness that inevitably unleashed. And I try to get people to check it out. And for some reason, I don't succeed. I mean, I got a fair amount of attention early on with the publication of that book, full page in the New York Times. My publicist at the University of California Press, oh, this is the kind of review that we kill for. Okay, it's out there. Not the hugest splash, but pretty big splash. Enough so I would have assumed that people would be thinking about it and would either try to find some way of refuting what I say are the conclusions we inevitably are compelled to get to. And I still believe that we are compelled to get to those conclusions. Or if you can't refute it, then you accept it. And if you're not ready to accept it, then you struggle with it. What are we going to do with this thing? If this guy's right, that has big ramifications like he shows in that book. Well, they did none of those things. They just walked away. And I've never, I've talked here and elsewhere about why that might be, but that's another one of those things that, years after years and years of thinking about it, it remains a very live question to me. I do want to assure people that I deliver the goods. I mean, and then that puts me in a very awkward position. I'm thinking, well, how do I get attention? How do I get people to check it out? I mean, what I've been doing here, I don't think has succeeded. And then I think, well, how do you get attention to something which should get attention? And then there's a temptation to have some kind of chutzpah, and already I've displayed a certain amount of chutzpah, when I say it puts important things in a fundamentally different light, or fundamental things in an importantly different light. That takes chutzpah. When I started presenting this thing on Daily Costs as a series, I introduced it with another piece of chutzpah, and I don't like doing this stuff, but how do I get attention? And if it's true that it might help human civilizations to survive, am I supposed to be inhibited about going out on that limb? Well, I'm kind of driven. So I introduced it with a piece, an integrative view of the human story or something like that might help human civilization to survive. That's a pretty big claim. It's not something that I'm comfortable claiming, but even that doesn't seem to be sufficient to get people to check it out. I mean, nobody's come back and said, oh, well, in your grandiosity, you made these claims. I went and looked. here's why this whole flimsy thing falls apart. Nobody's done that. It isn't flimsy. I've been looking at it for more than half a century, at least that foundational piece of it, developing more pieces. I don't know what I can do to get attention. I'm here doing these videos because my firstborn son told me, Dad, people aren't going to read how you've shown this stuff, but they might go listen to your videos. And he also tells me the fact that I've been doing it for whatever, it's 8 months, and there's no sign this is taking off. It's, one reconciles oneself and one doesn't. Fortunately, I've got reasons to continue to do this independently of whether I succeed in the mission, which is to get it out there. I don't mean it's not out there at all, but it's in order to have the beneficial impact I claim it could have, it has to get out there pretty big time. Not like everybody thinks that way, but, a major component of the way our civilization thinks about our situation and what we got to do. It's at least a significant piece of the world is looking at things and thinking this way. I hold myself back from some of the things that I feel like I could say because it's awkward to make claims. And I keep on thinking that that chutzpah might get the attention because people will say, what if it's true? What if he actually does have something here that could have that kind of an impact? I got to go look. Well, apparently, that's not what people think. When I wrote the beginning of that book, I gave myself permission to do the thing that as an American boy, I really don't like to do because chutzpah. I put it in the. I utilized a framework that Freud once used to say he's delivering something which should revolutionize the way people think. I think his contribution was important. I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, I utilized it at the beginning of that book and talked about how Copernicus and Newton revolutionized our concept of our place in the cosmos. And then Darwin came, and with the whole body of understanding of how life gets shaped, not Garden of Eden stuff, but an evolutionary process which works without a designer and without a creator, that works in a kind of an automatic unfolding of a system kind of a way where there's a non-random selection among diverse candidates for getting their DNA into the future. And that really revolutionized, for one thing, our place in the system of life, and no longer a special creation, but one more creature that's emerged out of a multifaceted million species evolutionary selective process creating a biosphere. I mean, Darwin didn't do all that, but that's where it leads. And then I say, that's my book, The Parable of the Tribes. And now comes the parable of the tribes. Yeah. Not the way a quarterback's supposed to talk after a good game, but that puts the crown of jewel of our species, this civilizational system, into a different light, where we are not so much the creators as the raw material and ultimately the victims. I'm paraphrasing myself. I haven't read it in a good while. If you want to Google Schmuckler, my last name, and first chapter of the parable of the tribes. There are a couple of websites that publish the whole first chapter with my permission back in the day. You can see how it unfolds and why some reviewers called it compelling. And it puts the apparatus that we've created into an importantly different light. At that time, maybe as a rhetorical mistake, but it was also a different time. There was a hubris in the world, I thought. And so I delivered the message as a humbling thing, saying that we have not been in control of where civilization's gone, that we've been in some fundamental ways less the creators and more the victims of the force that we unleashed in this system this disordered system into which we inadvertently plunged. We couldn't have foreseen it, but once we did it, our destiny was to be in a deeply troubled, traumatic, painful, very challenging place. The first creatures that aren't free to live according to the dictates of their nature. That's no small thing. Everybody else has been selected for living in their niche, and so were we. But this is not that niche. And so among the painful things that have come out of it is we've got a mismatch between the demands of the civilized systems and the needs and tendencies and of the creature. I thought it would be humbling to recognize that we're not the masters of our destiny. Not yet. I mean, that's my whole purpose in life since I first saw that thing, is how do we become the masters of our destiny? It involves a whole lot of things like defeating Donald Trump in the election, and it brings a whole lot of things like bringing this fascistic partisan Supreme Court under control, replacing it with a court that will actually implement our collective decisions about how justice is supposed to be working. This is the challenge of this moment. Putting Putin back in his box and maybe out of business is another one of the challenges of this moment. Taking the ugly, destructive dynamic of the brokenness of the Jews of Israel and of the Palestinians in their midst and surrounding them, and the Iranian regime, how to move that whole system to one that supports a stable and just peace in some future. All of these require understanding the nature of the brokenness that we're dealing with. It doesn't always have to be elaborated in very complex ways. Don't always have to bring in our child-rearing tendencies. Don't always have to deal with economics. There are different situations that call for different things, but we do need to see things whole. That will empower us to tune into the sources of wise guidance that are built into us to overcome the destructive force that we unleashed, to preserve American democracy, to create an order in the world where a nuclear holocaust cannot happen, and where our treatment of the rest of the living planet is compatible with our and its long-term thriving on the earth, rather than bringing, with our recklessness, the biospheric China shop down on our heads as bulls in this China shop. We have a challenge to meet as a species at many levels. I don't know. I do believe that there's an integrative way of seeing it that would be beneficial. It would make us better at beating Trump, better at reforming the Supreme Court, better at creating a better world order, better at overcoming things like the fossil fuel industry that is willing to sacrifice the human future for its own short-term profits. A lot of challenges. And we meet them all better if we see things as a whole. And I don't know how to get people to take a look at it. But one of the benefits for me is that taking the effort puts me in touch with the purpose of my life, stimulates me to dig down and do my best performance that is in me. However good or not good, it's just what I can do. And there's a fulfillment in all that. Sometimes just having to say things leads to seeing more things. And one of the great privileges in my life has been getting to see some things. So I think I've got the commitment to continue to do this. I hate the feeling of failure and futility. I like to think that my son is right, that failing for 8 months doesn't mean there isn't a future takeoff. But regardless, here I am. Here's my better human story. Here's the world that we're living in with all the troubling things that we see. And here's my best effort to help us get to the other side where the good things triumph over the evil things. Thank you.